Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one we have yet again several significant developments across the front line. Starting out in the Kurakhove direction, the Russians have now fully captured Maximilianivka, gaining full control over the settlement. Now, someone correctly mentioned with regards to Maximilianivka exactly what I said many months ago, following the Russian capture of Marinka, which happened December of 2023. The Russians would need to gain control over the highway to be able to secure Maximilianivka, as the high ground is located on the highway here, the H15 highway, located from 180 meters elevation, 170 meters, all towards Kurakhove, where Maximilianivka itself is located on 130 meters, Hreorivka is located on 134 meters. So we see that the locations here in between the settlement and the highway is a rising ground to the high ground by the highway. This means that the Ukrainian positions along the highway here to the south are all located on the high ground overlooking the settlements, and that means that any of the Russian positions along the settlements would be located on the low ground, and the Ukrainian forces will be overlooking them, and that puts them in a vulnerable position as long as the Ukrainians are present in these forest lines here in the highway direction. This means that the Russians need to gain control over the fortified positions here near Pobieda. Securing those will prevent the Ukrainians from having any feasible positions along the highway and the forest lines connected to it. This means that the Russians would then be able to launch an offensive operation along the highway, gaining control of it, securing their southern flank ahead of launching operations into Kurakhove. Kurakhove itself is a very interesting settlement. This is a city, and it is with apartment complex areas. It is similar to Selidove in size, and it also has an industrial area. It is near the Vovcha River line as a massive reservoir to the north, and then there is massive fortified positions to the east, west, and south of the settlement. The Russians are located and have captured Ostrivske, which cuts off the connection here to the north, but it also has this dam bridge here along the river line, which cuts off the connection between the north and the south. The only crossing would be the dam crossing itself. Therefore, the Russians would be unable to cross in the northern direction because that is simply too vulnerable. The Russians would instead advance along Maximilianivka towards Kurakhove along the residential areas to gain control over the northern bank of Kurakhove and to push towards the eastern parts. However, here the Ukrainians have several fortified positions, of which the Russians are already fighting over here to the southwest of Maximilianivka, after which we will see continuous fighting along the residential area and the fortified positions. But in conclusion, the Battle of Kurakhove has begun, but it is and will be a very complicated battle. It is very interesting with how many similarities there are between Kurakhove and Selidove. An example is the 2001 population estimate is 21,479. This is different from the 2022 estimate because it was a frontline settlement during the battles that took place during the Ukrainian Civil War. Selidove had a 2022 population estimate of 21,521. That is only a 42 population difference. If we take a look at the settlements themselves, we see it is a long settlement. It has apartment complex buildings and it has an industrial area. If we take a look at Selidove, it is exactly the same. Apartment complex area, industrial area, and it is on the longer side rather than a wide settlement. The battle itself will likely also follow a similar trend. For that, we have to take a look at Selidove. First, we saw with Selidove, the Russians managed to push through the eastern direction, reach the central parts of the settlement, after which the Ukrainians sent a lot of reinforcements to counterattack and regain control over the settlement, regaining full control over Selidove, as the eastern parts are part of Mikhailivka rather than Selidove, well as the industrial area in the north, kicking the Russians out, after which they went to focus on the flanks of the settlements, attacking both the northern and southern flank of Selidove. This has led to the Russians now cutting off the supplies arriving from the south, while at the same time pressuring the Ukrainian supply lines to the northwest and to the west, both of which are now less than 2 kilometers from encirclement. In the southern flank, we see a combined battle over the road connecting Selidove with its supply lines further southwest towards Andreevka, where the Russians are not just attacking towards the southern flank of Selidove, but also the fortified positions here to the west and in the western direction of Sukharine. We see a combined effort by the Russian forces near Sukharine to completely cut off any possible supplies going through the southern road. The Russians have managed to cut off the southern road near Vishneve. This, however, is not completely a done deal yet, due to the fact that the Ukrainians can counterattack. They recently sent the 154th Mechanized Brigade just to cover the southern flank, yet the Russians are continuously seeing success. However, the Ukrainians do have the necessary forces in the area to continue to contest these battles. So therefore, the Russians have a second plan and a third plan, plan A, B, and C. The first one has succeeded cutting off the road directly south of the settlement, and then the Russian forces will look to expand that cut off further south, likely all the way to Novodimitrivka, but mainly capturing the fortified positions. This will create a large control over the road, and that will significantly limit the Ukrainian capabilities to counterattack and regain control of the area. Now, the Russians are now moving towards Vishneve, which is the rear supply line and the most secure one that they have available. Losing that would practically put Ukrainian positions within Selidove in a complete encirclement. Therefore, the Ukrainians are looking to hold that at all costs. This would make it very difficult for the Russians to capture that, even though they are within 2 kilometers of it. Therefore, it is likely that the Russians will have more success fighting on a flank further south towards Novoalexivka, and then further along that to gain longer and wider fire control over the railways and roads going through Vishneve here to the west of Selidove, which will allow the Russians to spot not a physical encirclement, but a operational encirclement that is secure enough and wide enough that most of the supplies would simply be hit on the run inside of Selidove, and if the Ukrainians withdraw from Selidove, they will be under heavy fire. Now, we've seen from the Battle of Vuhledar and generally all throughout the front line, any of these major areas that fighting takes place, especially cities, the Ukrainians refuse to withdraw from, as they want to make full advantage of them holding a city. This is why the Russians withdrew from the settlement and worked entirely on the flanks instead. The Ukrainians have 3 brigades that were sent to defend Selidove, and all 3 of them are located within or around the settlement. Mostly on the flanks, there's the 68th Jaeger Brigade, and there is the 154th Mechanized Brigade. On top of that, there is the 152nd Jaeger Brigade and the 25th Airborne Brigade, all of which are main units that are defending within Selidove and the flanks of it. There's also the 125th Battalion of the 113th Territorial Defense Brigade. However, these are really just units that don't really have a significant impact on the battle. Further north along Novohradivka, conducting mainly counterattacks, there's the 425th Separate Assault Battalion, the 93rd Mechanized Brigade's Battalion Tactical Group, the 1st Battalion of the 3rd Operational Brigade, Spartan, and the 2nd Assault Battalion of the 5th Assault Brigade. As we can see, all of these are assault units. Their objective is to counterattack towards Novohradivka, exert heavy pressure, and prevent the Russians from establishing positions here near Lysky and the general area north of Selidove, west of Novohradivka. At the same time, the main Russian forces in this direction is the 90th Tank Division and its 27th Motorized Rifle Division, who are acting in this section of the front line. They are split between Novohradivka and Ukrainsk, where they aren't acting independently, but as a combined unit to conduct offensive operations towards Selidove in the center, the south of Pokrovsk, both in the direction of Lysivka, Sukhyar, and Mirnorad, as well as in the direction of the west of Sukharine and towards Novoselidivka. All of these operations are a combined effort between these two divisions. These are the same forces who have been fighting over Selidove, or this section of the front line, since the fall of Avdiivka, and these are the ones who are reportedly, not official information, but reportedly going to be rotated out and replaced by new fresh units. Now, in the direction of Kurakhove, if we take the example of Selidove, we can see that there are similarly two flanks to be fought over, which would cut off a lot of the supply lines and limit the supplies going in and out of Kurakhove, similar to that of Selidove. And this is why we're seeing a similar tendency, which is the Russian push south of Sukharine towards Novoselidivka, Kreminna Belka, and so on. Their objective is to cut off the pocket here in the eastern parts by capturing everything north of the Vovcha River, north of Kurakhove. It will also allow the Russians to then develop offensive operations towards Kurakhove from the rear, where the fortified positions do not cover in the direction of Dashna, and the western flank of Kurakhove, combining that with a push from Maximilianivka. Both of the flanks would be under attack, and the objective of the Russians would be to squeeze the Ukrainians out of the settlements in a southern direction, away from any sort of withdrawal. And the objective of that would be to force the Ukrainians into a more vulnerable position along the river line here north of Volodar, as the Russians continue offensive operations in the southern direction as well, and pushing the Ukrainians away. The objective is to connect the Russian forces from three separate directions. From Sukharine in the north towards the western flank of the Ukrainians in Kurakhove, in the eastern flank by Kurakhove itself, and from the southern flank. This will be to cut off Kurakhove completely from any sort of reinforcements or supplies, any withdrawal. Everything will be cut off for the Ukrainians with such an operation. And that is why we see that the three main points of the Russian offensive operations are exactly these three directions towards Kurakhove. There's no operations directly towards it. There's no plan of a direct assault towards Kurakhove, at least not as the situation is now. Instead, the Russians will look to develop their positions away from Kurakhove until they have secured most of the supply lines, limiting the Ukrainian fighting capability and encouraging them to withdraw from whatever gaps they can find in the encirclement maneuver. At the same time, there are separate offensive operations taking place for Velika Novosilka further south. So you see that in general there are three separate offensive operations here in the southern parts of the Donetsk region. There's the Battle of Velika Novosilka, there's the Battle of Kurakhove, and there's the Battle of Selidove. Moving on to the Chasiv Yar direction, there are Russian advances in three separate directions. The crossing between the micro-district and the eastern parts of Chasiv Yar has now been connected and secured under Russian control yet again. The Ukrainians are being pushed back along the fortified positions along the canal. At the same time, the Russians have advanced along this gap here, but have managed to push the Ukrainians further back. And in the northern parts, there's the Shilkid footage confirming further Russian advances there as well. Based on this, we see that there's a general offensive push by the Russians along the eastern district of Chasiv Yar, but the objective is, again, to expand their crossings across the canal and a foothold within the western bank of the canal, to then push into the central parts of Chasiv Yar. This takes place as the Russians have secured the southern flank, where the crossing by Ivanivske and the TO504 highway has been secured. There's likely be a push by the Russians along the first area as well to push into and connect the entire canal line here by the east of Chasiv Yar between the Ivanivske direction and the TO504 highway into the south, all the way to the north by Hryurivka. The Russians will look to gain full control of the crossings in that area. This will allow the Russians to launch larger operations in the direction of Chasiv Yar, expand their presence across, and increase their pressure with their own artillery and FPV drone strikes. Moving on to the next section of the front line, we see here in the direction of Vishneve, the Russians have advanced within the settlements, gained a foothold, and are pushing the Ukrainians towards the northern outskirts of it, as the Russians are securing their crossing across the Serbis River line near Andrivka. At the same time, the Russians have also expanded their foothold within the settlement of Kuslinikivka in the southern parts of the Pishana River line, So we see that the Russians continued offensive operations here, mainly in small assault groups. The objective is to expand the zone of control across the river lines and to secure a foothold in different settlements as they increase the pressure on Ukrainian positions. Both of these advances are separate offensive operations. One is in the direction of Borova, the other is in the direction of Zinkove. The one in the direction of Berova, we were going to see the Russian capture of Vishneve and then a push towards Petrushevleve. The objective of the Russians here would be to gain control over this village chain here west of Serbis river line, similar to the objective near Nadia Tverdelkhlubovo. And the objective of the Russians is to gain control over the Luhansk Oblast, as well as to gain a foothold along the village chain here and develop offensive operations towards Borova along the two main roads, which is from the village chain in the south and the village chain in the north. The village chain in the south is an effort by the Russians across the Serbis river line in the south, from Makiivka towards Rakivka and by Novovodiane. In general, the Russians are launching several offensive operations here in the Kreminna-Luhansk direction. In the north towards Kupiansk, this is connected by operations from Tabivka, Kislivka direction, and from the Zinkivka direction. There's a push towards Zinkove, further south towards Borova, and in the southern parts towards Liman. The objective of the Russians is to gain control over the eastern bank of the Uskar river line. The Russians have a lot of forces here in the Kreminna-Svatove direction near the Uskar river line. However, they are still conducting these smaller positional fighting operations where they're making full use of their artillery and drone capabilities. However, their assault units are being used sparingly. This means that in general, the Russians have a significant firepower advantage, but they're not really making the most of it since they do not advance whenever the Ukrainians open up a gap in their defense. They simply do a safe and secure step-by-step positional fight. And the objective of this is to keep their own soldiers as safe as possible while doing these offensive operations to continue the build-up of Russian forces. If they go and commit to too much, they will eventually take too many casualties to the point at which their offensive forces will not grow, they will still decline. And that is what they want to avoid. If they want to win this battle of attrition, it's going to be a battle between inflicting as many casualties as possible while saving as many of your own soldiers as possible. The Russians are clearly doing this well, considering that their army is much larger now than it was just a year ago, and their Russian offensive operations are steadily increasing to a stronger fighting force bit by bit. In the Kursk region, we see that the Russians have managed to capture the settlement of Novaya Soroshina. It was confirmed. So we now see that the Russians are indeed pushing to cut off the Ukraine supplies here from even Novo-Ivanovka towards Malaya Luknia and from the northern direction as well. The objective is to gain control over this village chain here along the river line and railway line to cut off any of the Ukrainian positions further northwest. It is clear based on the recent developments that the Russians are now mainly focusing on avoiding any sort of battle as much as possible, and the way to do that is that they work entirely on these pincer maneuver, flanking maneuvers to cut off any supply lines to Ukrainians available. And in the Kursk region is a prime example of how these Ukrainian supply lines are very limited due to the developments that took place, as a lot of everything is really connected to Sucha in what the Ukrainians have in the Kursk region, and that means that everything points towards one direction, and every single part of the Ukrainian offensive operations in the Kursk region is based on supply roads going from Sucha to that front line. If the Russians cut off that connection, then the Ukrainians will be left without supplies. So we see here in the western direction, if the Russians cut off Svetkovo, there will be no supplies all the way to Koronevo. Cut off this one here, there will be no supplies in the northwestern parts. Cut off here, there will be no supplies by Machanovka, and so on. So everything is connected to Sucha. The Russians have, being fully aware of this, have made all of their planning according to that. This is why they completely ignored the northern flank of the Ukrainian Kursk offensive to focus on the southern flank, where they'll be looking to cut off the roads here in this direction near Svetlikovo. When that failed, they decided to do it further upwards, where they cut off the ones supplying Olgovka, leaving the Ukrainian forces there completely cut off from supplies and withdrawal, encircling their forces. And similarly, in the direction of Tolsyuk and Lyubimovka, the Ukrainians refused to withdraw. This led to an encirclement of their forces. Now they are making use of their newly gained territories to push near Leonidovo towards Malaya Lugnia, and from the eastern parts as well, to cut off the Ukrainian positions further north. And they'll likely continue doing so to cut off bit after bit. If they manage to cut off this northern parts, the next objective would be advancing along the road to cut off the supplies towards this pocket here, creating a new one. And we see that the Russians still hold on to positions here near Marchanovka, where the objective would be to push alongside that towards the railways, which will cut off the supplies between that and Sucha, which will cut off the supplies of the Ukrainians in the area. And the Ukrainians will either be forced to withdraw or be encircled like Lyubimovka. The Ukrainians are trying to preemptively prevent this by launching further offensive operations by Marchanovka, preventing the Russians from making use of the positions here in the east and strengthening the flank to prevent such an operation from taking place. But that can redirect the Russian forces to attack the supply line going into Sucha instead, as again, Sucha is the supply hub of the Ukrainians. Everything goes through Sucha. Cutting off the supplies to Sucha will completely cut off the supplies that comes from Sucha, and therefore the Ukrainians in the entirety of the Kursk region would really be cut off from supplies. And that is really the current situation all across the front line. We see several developments taking place every day as Russians continue their offensive operations. The Ukrainians are entirely on the defensive. They do not have any time or efforts to put into offensive operations. Any offensive operations they launch is simply a counterattack to prevent success of the Russian offensive operations, to catch them off balance, to exploit any weaknesses presented themselves. But all of them is focused and revolved around defensive operations. And this is what has been the general trend throughout the Russian offensive the start of October of last year, except for the Kursk incursion, and that has now also switched into this, yet again, defensive focus operation all across the front line. What impacts does that have on the front line? Well, it means that the Ukrainians simply cannot launch any offensive operations, and they'll continue to lose territory bit by bit, while they are also putting all of their efforts into holding their territory as much as possible, to the point that they refuse to withdraw from settlements that are at danger of being encircled. And at that point, important brigades can be lost to these battles, like the 72nd in Volodar. If we see something similar in Selidove, Toretsk, Kursk, and everywhere else across the front line, then eventually the Ukrainians will have no units left to defend with, and the Russians will just launch another massive offensive operation, where they in the end will take control over large parts of Ukrainian territory, potentially. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.